Welcome to A Fated Mate's Werewolf Shifter Romance Audiobook. If you're new to our channel, we invite you to subscribe and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with our daily releases of captivating mystery tale stories. And if you enjoy our content, don't forget to leave a like to show your support. For our loyal listeners, welcome back. We're excited to have you here again. Let's dive into another unforgettable tale. Act 1. The Lone Wolf. The wind rolled in from the valley, thick with the scent of pine and something else, something wrong. Dominic Veil sniffed the air, his jaw tightening. A storm was coming, but not the kind that made the trees groan and the river swell. This was different. This was trouble. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, though the cold didn't bother him. The forest stretched out before him, dark and waiting. A wolf's domain, his domain. Once he hadn't been part of a pack in years, not since the lies and the exile. But even a lone wolf knew when something was off. The moon sat fat and full above the ridge, casting long shadows between the trees. His boots were silent against the earth, instincts taking over where thoughts failed. He moved like a ghost, blending into the dark, listening. The night had its own rhythm, rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the steady hum of the river, but tonight something was out of tune. Then he heard it, a whisper of movement where there shouldn't be one, soft, careful, trained. Dominic's lip curled. Someone was hunting on Blackridge land. He dropped low, his muscles coiling tight as he followed the sound. No scent yet, just the rustle of feet in dry leaves, the slight creak of leather shifting against a body. He slipped through the undergrowth, careful not to snap a twig or brush against the ferns. Whoever they weren't amateurs. Then he saw them. 4 figures moving in a loose formation, their eyes sweeping the ground, their hands light on their weapons. Rifles slung across their backs, knives strapped to their belts. They weren't poachers, not the kind looking for deer anyway. They were hunting something else, something bigger. Wolves. Dominic clenched his fists, his breath slow and even. They didn't smell like shifters. They were human. That made it worse. A pack war he could handle, but humans getting too close to sacred land? That meant something had leaked. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a military stance, signaled to the others. They fanned out, scanning the trees with night vision goggles. High-end gear. Not some backwoods hunters stumbling in for a thrill. No, these men had money behind them. Dominic moved closer, careful to keep downwind. He needed to hear them. Should be near the ridge. The voice was low, rough, a leader's voice. Still no sign of them, another grumbled. You sure the intel's good? A pause. Then, Voss doesn't make mistakes. Dominic went still. Voss? That name carried weight. Luther Voss was the kind of man who didn't waste his time on things that didn't make him richer. He was ruthless, powerful, and smart enough to stay out of the light. If he had men sniffing around Blackridge land, it meant only one thing. It was looking for wolves. Dominic exhaled slowly, keeping his pulse steady. He should turn back. This wasn't his fight, hadn't been for a long time. But the pull in his gut said otherwise. So he stayed in the shadows and watched. The wind had shifted. Dominic felt it before he smelled it. Something cutting through the pine and damp earth. Something that didn't belong. Then the scent hit him, curling into his lungs like smoke from a dying fire. Warm, clean, something just a little sweet, like honey on steel. Not a hunter, not a wolf. A woman. His eyes tracked her as she stepped out of the tree line, the moon throwing silver across her auburn hair. She moved with a kind of focused precision, her boots crunching against the dry brush, shoulders squared like she belonged here. She didn't. Dominic stayed low, the muscles in his back coiling tight. The woman wasn't dressed for a hunt. No rifle, no knives strapped to her thigh. But she wasn't lost either. She had purpose. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, set down a leather satchel and pulled out a small device. Something that blinked green against her palm. A scanner. Geologist! Dominic's mouth twitched. A scientist poking around Blackridge land? That wasn't coincidence. Not with Voss's men sniffing around. She crouched, pressing the scanner to the dirt, her brow furrowing in concentration. The device beeped softly. She adjusted the settings. Another beep. Dominic should have left right then, should have turned and disappeared into the trees, but he didn't. He watched. The night stretched between them, a breathless, soundless thing. Then, as if sensing it, him. She looked up. Their eyes locked, a sharp pull in his gut, a hit, clean and deep, straight to the bone. Primal, immediate. His wolf snarled awake inside him, clawed against his ribs. The world narrowed to that single moment, that single stare. Her eyes were green, cut through with gold flecks that caught the moonlight. There was something in them, sharp, searching. She didn't flinch, didn't drop her gaze like most humans did when a predator was watching. She should have. She tilted her head slightly, her lips parting as if she felt it too, felt the pull, the inevitability of it. No. Dominic gritted his teeth, breaking the moment, tearing his stare from hers. His pulse was too fast, his breath too sharp. Fated. The words slammed through him like a blade. No, not her. Not now. His hands clenched at his sides, every muscle wound tight, his body urging him forward. Take her. Mark her. Protect her. He forced himself back. Not a chance. But even as he pulled into the shadows, even as the night swallowed him whole, her scent clung to him, and no matter how far he ran, he knew one thing. She was his. The night was black ink spilled over the land, the kind of darkness that swallowed noise and left only the whisper of the wind. Serena Callaway stepped out of her jeep and inhaled. The air was sharp, filled with pine and damp earth, tinged with something old, ancient even. She pulled her coat tighter and grabbed her satchel from the passenger seat. The cover story was airtight. Environmental research, survey work for conservation, all stamped and approved by the right bureaucrats. A few permits, a few polite emails, and no one asked too many questions. That was the trick. Keep it simple. Keep it clean. She wasn't here for conservation. Her boots sank slightly into the soft dirt as she moved toward the clearing. The trees loomed tall, pressing in like a silent audience. She set her equipment down. A small scanner, a geological core sampler, a map marked with hand-drawn notes. The official version said she was looking for soil instability. The real version, something was under this land. She'd seen the readings before, back in the lab. Subtle distortions in the rock layers, energy signatures that shouldn't exist. Most geologists would chalk it up to magnetic anomalies, an old fault line shifting under the weight of time. But Serena knew better. She pressed a few buttons on the scanner, watched the green light flicker to life. A soft hum filled the air, barely audible, a vibration more than a sound. The readings started rolling in. She scanned the numbers, her pulse picking up. The energy was here, she could feel it, thrumming under her feet like a heartbeat. A shiver ran up her spine. Luther Voss hadn't been wrong. The land was hiding something. The question was, what? And why did it feel like something was watching her? Serena was kneeling by the scanner, adjusting the sensitivity, when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of boots on dirt. Not the quiet, measured steps of someone passing through. These were deliberate. A man who wanted to be heard. She didn't look up right away. She finished pressing the last few buttons, the device humming under her fingers, before letting out a slow breath and standing. The man in front of her was tall, built like a soldier, with the kind of posture that said he'd spent his life at attention. Close-cropped black hair, sharp brown eyes, broad shoulders under a thick leather jacket. He wasn't smiling. "Didn't think we had visitors out this way," he said, voice smooth. Serena dusted off her hands. "I filed the permits weeks ago." "That right?" His gaze flicked to the scanner, the satchel, the map still pinned under a rock. "That's right," she said. She let a polite, unimpressed expression settle on her face. the kind that worked on security officers and bureaucrats. Geological survey, soil and stability reports. All very boring, I assure you. The man didn't move, but something in the air did. It tightened, like a rope pulled just enough to feel. You're on Pack land? She didn't flinch. I wasn't aware it was claimed. It is, he said, and we don't like strangers sticking their noses in it, especially after dark. Ah, there was the subtle threat. She crossed her arms. A work to do. Then do it fast. He held her gaze for a long second before stepping back. I'd be gone before nightfall if I were you. And just like that he turned, vanishing into the tree line as quickly as he'd come. Serena exhaled, rolling her shoulders. Something told her that wasn't the last warning she'd get. The sun was sinking fast, bruising the sky with streaks of red and violet. The scanner was still whirring, collecting its quiet little secrets from the land, but Serena wasn't paying attention to the numbers anymore. Something felt off. She glanced over her shoulder. The trees stood still, dark silhouettes against the dying light. Nothing moved. No wind, no rustling. Just silence. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't the nervous type. She'd spent months alone in the field, knee-deep in rock formations with nothing but the sound of her own breathing, but this was different. This wasn't alone. She was being watched. The feeling slid down her spine, slow and certain, like fingers brushing against her skin. She turned sharply. Nothing. Just trees. She let out a breath, shaking her head. Maybe the enforcer's little warning had gotten under her skin more than she wanted to admit. She turned back to the scanner, and then she felt it again. Not just being watched. Hunted. She snapped her head around, faster this time. But whoever, whatever, was out there, they were already gone. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, but Sarah stayed. She told herself it was because the data was important, because she was close to a breakthrough. The scanner had picked up something deep in the bedrock, something pulsing just beneath the layers of ancient stone, something alive. But she knew the real reason. The land itself seemed to call to her. Even now, with the last glimmers of twilight fading into deep indigo, she felt it humming beneath her feet. The air was thick with it, charged and heavy like standing on the edge of a storm. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying scents of pine and damp earth, but also something more, something primal, something watching. She should have listened to the warning, Packland did. That's what the enforcer had called it, and if experience had taught her anything, it was that people, whether human or not, got territorial about what they believed was theirs. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something here, buried beneath the earth and the secrets, something worth risking a little danger. The trees swayed, rustling in a rhythm that didn't quite match the wind. A shiver ghosted down her spine. She wasn't alone. Serena straightened, her hand tightening around the strap of her satchel. The rational part of her brain told her it was just nerves, just the dark playing tricks. The rest of her, the part that had been honed by instinct, by too many close calls in too many foreign lands, that part told her to run. But it was already too late. The growl came low and deep, a warning that sent ice slicing through her veins. She turned fast, her breath catching as shadows shifted between the trees. Eyes, too many of them, gleamed in the darkness. Wolves. Not the ordinary kind, not the kind that skulked through national parks and avoided human contact. These moved with intent, with purpose, and they were closing in. Her pulse jumped, adrenaline surging like a wildfire. They were big, bigger than they should be, their forms blurred at the edges, caught between human and beast, and even in the dim light she could see the sharp gleam of fangs, the coiled power in their bodies. Shifters. She might have been fascinated if she weren't about to die. One of them stepped forward, half-shifted, taller than the others, broad and built like a battering ram. His eyes glowed molten gold. "You shouldn't be here." His voice was rough, edged with something more animal than human. Serena swallowed, forcing her shoulders to square even as her stomach clenched. Didn't realize this was a private park. A second wolf, this one still in full beast form, snarled, snapping its teeth an inch from her boot. Not friendly. The leader cocked his head, studying her, the way a predator studies prey. "Who sent you?" "Sent you?" She let out a humorless laugh, fighting to keep her breathing steady. "I work for myself." He didn't look convinced. Another step, another growl. Her fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and for once in her life she didn't try to fight. She ran. The second her boots hit the dirt, the wolves moved. She sprinted, dodging low-hanging branches, her breath burning in her lungs. The terrain worked against her, uneven, unfamiliar. Her pack slammed against her back with every stride, and she had no doubt they were playing with her, letting her think she had a chance. A flash of fur to her right, another behind her. She was being herded. She veered left, hoping to break their formation, but a dark shape cut her off. The leader. He hadn't even broken a sweat. Serena skidded to a stop, heart hammering. Nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The leader bared his teeth, stepping forward, his eyes flashing in the dark. "I ask you one more time!" A new growl cut through the air, deeper, meaner, and the moment it hit, the pack stiffened. Everything changed. The growl that shattered the night wasn't like the others. It didn't just promise pain. It commanded it. It was deep, rough-edged, filled with fury that carried through the air like a thunderclap. Serena felt the shift before she saw him. One moment the wolves around her were poised to strike, their golden eyes locked on their prey. The next, they hesitated, ears flattening, bodies tensing with something dangerously close to fear. Then he emerged from the darkness. He moved like a shadow, fast and lethal, his form shifting mid-step, human 1 second, beast the next. The change was seamless, effortless, terrifying. When he landed in front of her, it was in full wolf form, black as the night itself, massive, powerful, and he was pissed. The leader of the rogue pack barely had time to react before Dominic lunged. The sound of their bodies colliding was pure violence, bone-crunching force, snarls that sent shivers racing up her spine. Serena stumbled back, chest heaving. The fight was brutal, raw. The rogues weren't small, weren't weak, but Dominic moved through them like a force of nature, tearing through their ranks with brutal precision. Teeth met flesh. Blood sprayed. The sharp cries of wolves filled the clearing. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it was over. The surviving rogues fled, melting into the night. Serena didn't move. She wasn't sure she could. Her body still thrummed with adrenaline, her breath coming fast and uneven. And Dominic. He turned toward her, shifting back, the transition as fluid as water, naked, powerful, dangerous. His chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, streaks of blood, not his own, marking his skin. The moonlight carved over his sharp features, his golden eyes locked on hers. Serena knew she should look away, should turn, should run, should say something to break the thick electric silence stretching between them, but she couldn't, because in that moment she knew, whatever had just happened, whatever had drawn him here, whatever had made him tear through those wolves like nothing else mattered, it was for her, and that terrified her more than anything. He took a step closer. The air between them pulsed, heated, charged. His gaze dropped to her throat, her pulse hammering there. His lips parted slightly, as if he could taste the air between them. "Are you hurt?" His voice was low, rough, barely human. She shook her head because words weren't possible right now. Something passed between them, something dark and consuming, something inevitable. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, Dominic took a step back, muscles coiled tight, like he was forcing himself to move away. "Go," he said, voice strained, "before I change my mind." It should have been a warning, but it sounded like a promise. Serena drove faster than she should have, her hands tight on the wheel, her pulse still hammering against her skin. It wasn't fear, at least not the kind she understood. She should have been terrified. She had been cornered by wolves, Not just wolves, shifters. And if Dominic hadn't shown up when he did, she didn't want to think about what would have happened. But it wasn't terror that still thrummed in her veins. It was him. She could still feel him, his presence, his energy, like an invisible tether stretching between them no matter how far she drove. Her body still hummed from the moment he stepped between her and the rogues, from the sheer raw power of him, and the way he'd looked at her, not just protective, not just angry, possessive. The look in his eyes had told her everything. He knew something she didn't, and deep down, even if she didn't want to admit it, she felt it too. Dominic sat on the edge of the ridge, staring out over the darkened valley, the scent of pine thick in the night air. The wind moved through the trees, rustling the leaves in a soft, whispering rhythm, but he heard nothing except the pounding of his own pulse. Her scent was still on him. No matter how deep into the woods he ran, no matter how hard he tried to shake it, it clung to his skin, his clothes, his soul. Serena, his mate. The word alone sent something wild and raw through him, something he wasn't ready for. Fate had a cruel sense of humor. He had spent years carving himself away from the pack, from bonds, from the idea of belonging to anyone or anything. He had convinced himself he could live alone, survive alone, that it was safer that way. And now this woman, this stubborn, sharp-tongued scientist, with her two curious eyes and her refusal to be afraid of him, was tearing through every wall he'd built. He had felt it the moment their eyes met, that visceral, primal pull that locked him in place, that made the air between them thick and charged. The mate bond was absolute, unshakable, undeniable, but he would deny it. He had to, because love, real, fated, destined love, only ever led to ruin. He had seen it before. Watched his father break under the weight of losing his mate, watched the way the bond didn't just connect, it consumed, and when it was gone, it destroyed. He wouldn't be weak like that. He wouldn't let himself be ruled by fate. With a low growl, he pushed himself to his feet, rolling his shoulders against the tension settling deep in his bones. He would stay away from her. He had to, for her sake. For his own. But even as he told himself that, even as he vowed to let the pull fade into nothing, he knew it was already too late. Dominic found her by the fire. She had made camp near the base of the ridge, the glow of the flames flickering over her skin, turning the copper strands of her hair into something rich and molten. She sat with her legs stretched out, boots dusty from the long day, her hands wrapped around a metal cup, steam curling from it in slow, lazy spirals. She looked, too, at ease, as if she hadn't nearly been torn apart by rogues a few hours ago, as if she belonged here. She didn't, and it was his job to make sure she left. His boots crunched over the dirt as he stepped forward. Her shoulders stiffened slightly, just slightly, before she glanced up. She didn't look surprised to see him. "You again," she murmured, tilting her head, the firelight catching on her eyes. That pull hit him again, sharp and deep, like a hook in the gut. His jaw tightened against it. "I told you to go." His voice came out rougher than he intended, low and edged with warning. She took a slow sip of whatever she was drinking, unbothered. "And I told you, I have work to do." "Your work almost got you killed." She arched a brow. "Then maybe you should be thanking me for giving you something to fight." His patience, what little of it he had, thinned. "You don't belong here. And yet here I am." Damn stubborn woman. The wind shifted, and with it came her scent. Subtle, warm, something that didn't just brush against him but wrapped around him. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. He should turn around, walk away, let her deal with the consequences of her own recklessness. Instead, the words were out before he could stop them. "I'll take you out of the territory tomorrow." She blinked, something flickering behind her eyes. "Is that an order?" "It's a fact." She set her cup down, watching him now, studying him the way she had studied the rock formations earlier. He didn't like it. He didn't like the way she saw him, like she was peeling back layers he hadn't let anyone near in years. And if I say no? His jaw clenched. Then you're an idiot. A slow smile curved her lips. Charming? This isn't a game, Serena. Her smile faded, just slightly. No, she said softly. It's not. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled between them, sending shadows dancing over the hard planes of his face. Finally, she nodded once. Fine, tomorrow. He didn't wait for more. Didn't wait to say anything he'd regret. He turned and disappeared into the trees, trying to ignore the ache already settling deep in his bones. Because tomorrow he would take her away, and he would never see her again. At least that's what he told himself, even though every part of him already knew it was a damn lie. Of course it had to storm. Not just any storm, not the kind that politely whispered over the treetops and misted the ground in a romantic little drizzle. No, this one was a full-blown tempest, wind howling like some vengeful spirit, rain lashing the earth with a vengeance, the sky split open with jagged streaks of lightning, thunder rolling so hard I could feel it in my ribs. And of course I was stuck with him. Dominic moved ahead of me, his broad frame cutting through the rain as if it were nothing but a mild inconvenience, while I stumbled over rocks and roots, my boots slipping in the mud. "This is your fault," I huffed, yanking my jacket tighter around me. He didn't even slow down. "How exactly is the weather my fault?" "Because you know what? Never mind. Just find the damn cave." Another bolt of lightning cracked through the sky, illuminating the forest in eerie flashes. The wind screamed, and the rain pounded harder, drenching me to the bone. I was cold. I was miserable, and I was not above whining about it. Then, suddenly, Dominic stopped short. I nearly slammed into his back, because apparently he was made of stone, and not prone to reacting to basic things like wet humans barreling into him. He turned slightly, and even in the dim, storm-lit night, I caught the sharp glint of his golden eyes. He lifted his chin toward a jagged rock formation a few feet ahead. There! A cave. Thank whatever deity oversaw shifters and stubborn geologists. I didn't wait for an invitation. I stomped past him, half running into the shelter of the cave's entrance. It was shallow, but deep enough to block the worst of the wind, and that was good enough for me. I peeled off my soaking jacket, my fingers numb, my hair plastered to my face in what I could only assume was a highly unattractive fashion. Dominic, meanwhile, looked as unbothered as ever, shaking the water from his dark hair like some kind of brooding, mythological creature who had never known discomfort. Unfair. Completely unfair. I rubbed at my arms, teeth chattering as I eyed him. "What, you don't even get cold?" He glanced at me, then slowly, deliberately, ran a hand through his wet hair, sending more droplets scattering. "Not like you do. Great. Just what I needed. A werewolf with a superior immune system." I dropped onto a dry patch of rock, huffing. Figures. I get stuck in a storm and I don't even get the fun, cozy part of it. No fireplace, no blankets, no warm drinks. Dominic gave me a long, unreadable look before sighing. Then, with the kind of reluctant patience that suggested he already regretted what he was about to do, he crouched down, pulled out a lighter from his pack, and flicked it on. The tiny flame danced for a second before he brought it to a pile of dry wood he must have stashed there earlier. The fire caught, crackling to life, throwing flickering shadows against the cave walls. I blinked at him. "Okay, points for dramatic timing." He shook his head, settling himself across from me. "You complain a lot." "It's one of my best qualities," a smirk. Tiny, fleeting, but there. Tugged at the corner of his mouth before he leaned back against the cave wall, stretching out his long legs. I curled up closer to the fire, rubbing warmth back into my fingers. The rain continued to hammer outside, but in here, in the dim, flickering light, the world seemed smaller, quieter. For the first time in hours, the tension between us didn't feel as sharp. For the first time, Dominic didn't look like he was 2 seconds from bolting. I rested my chin on my knees, watching him. "You don't talk much, do you?" He exhaled through his nose, his gaze flicking to the fire. "Most people talk enough for me." I snorted. "You mean me?" "You said it, not me." I shook my head, staring into the flames. Silence stretched between us, the kind that wasn't entirely uncomfortable. Then, quietly, without looking at me, he asked, "Why were you really out there?" I hesitated, because I could lie. I should lie. But something about the way he asked made me pause, like he already knew, like he just wanted to hear me say it. I swallowed. "Because there's something out there, something in the land." He was silent for a long moment, then, "You don't belong here, Serena." I met his gaze, something deep and raw threading through my chest. "Neither do you," I whispered. The fire crackled, the rain poured, and for just a second it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. I dreamed of wolves. Not just one or two, but an entire pack, silent and fast, their bodies fluid as shadows, their eyes burning like embers in the dark. They moved beneath the earth, their paws barely touching the ground, as if they were running on something older than stone, something alive. I ran with them. I could feel the wind whipping through my hair, the steady pound of paws. My paws, against the soft earth. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp moss, with something wilder beneath it, something that hummed like an ancient heartbeat. The ground wasn't just dirt and rock, it breathed. The deeper we ran, the more the world around us changed. The roots of trees stretched downward like fingers, glowing faintly with golden veins of energy, pulsing in time with the rhythm of my own racing pulse. I should have been afraid, but I wasn't, because I knew this place. I didn't know how, but I did. The largest wolf, massive, black as the sky, with eyes like molten gold, ran beside me. He didn't look at me, not directly, but I felt him. Felt his presence as surely as I felt the earth beneath me, the wind against my skin. Dominic! Even in sleep I knew it was him. I turned my head to speak, to ask him what the hell was happening, but before I could, the ground cracked open beneath us, a flash of light, a roar of sound, and then I woke up, gasping. The cave was dark, the fire burning low, the scent of smoke and damp stone filling my lungs. My pulse hammered against my ribs, my skin damp with sweat. I wasn't alone. Dominic was still there, still stretched out against the cave wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his head tilted slightly, like he wasn't quite asleep, but not fully awake either. I swallowed hard, my heart still racing from the dream. It had felt too real, like something I wasn't supposed to see, but somehow already knew. Like something waiting for me, beneath the earth, waiting to wake up. The fire had burned down to a soft glow, flickering shadows stretching along the cave walls, licking at the edges of the dark. The storm outside had quieted to a steady drizzle, the kind that made the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. Dominic was quiet. Not his usual brooding, I'd rather eat nails than make conversation quiet, but something else, something heavier. I sat cross-legged by the fire, tracing absent patterns into the dirt with my fingertips, sneaking glances at him in the low light. He was leaned back against the cave wall, long legs stretched out, arms loose over his chest. His eyes were half-lidded, unreadable, his face carved in flickering gold from the dying fire. But he wasn't asleep, and for once he wasn't looking at me like I was an unsolvable problem. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "So what's a guy like you doing in a place like this?" One slow blink, then another. "What?" I grinned. "I mean, you don't exactly scream lone wolf by choice. There's a reason you're out here instead of back with your pack, right?" He exhaled through his nose. "You ask too many questions." "Journalistic curiosity, occupational hazard." I leaned in, resting my chin on my knees. "Come on, we're trapped in a cave, waiting out a storm. What else are we supposed to do? Stare at the walls? He didn't answer. For a second I thought that was the end of it, that he'd clamp his jaw shut and ignore me until morning, like a perfectly reasonable and not ridiculously frustrating person. But then I was exiled. The words came quiet, rough, like they had weight, like they weren't used to being spoken. I straightened a little. Exiled? His gaze flicked to the fire. Banished. Cast out. Take your pick. I frowned, trying to piece together what little I knew about werewolves and their rules. You don't seem like the banishable type. A dry huff of laughter. That's because you don't know me. I tilted my head. So tell me. He hesitated, and then, before he could talk himself out of it, there was a fight. Someone died. I waited, watching the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands curled into loose fists over his thighs. I was blamed, he said, finally. His voice was too steady, too controlled, like he had told himself the story so many times it had lost its edges, smoothed down into something he could hold without it cutting too deep. But it wasn't your fault. I didn't phrase it as a question. Something flickered in his expression so fast I almost missed it. No, he admitted. But sometimes the truth doesn't matter. The fire crackled between us, filling the silence. I didn't know what to say to that. I should have told him I was sorry, that it wasn't fair, that he deserved better. But he already knew all of that. Instead, I reached for a stick and poked at the embers, watching the way they glowed red, hot, tiny sparks drifting into the air. Well, I said after a while, at least you're really committed to the whole mysterious lone wolf aesthetic. A snort. An actual snort. I grinned, leaning back on my hands. Seriously, though, if I had to get lost in the woods with a brooding, self-imposed exile, at least you're the interesting kind. He shook his head, but there was something in his expression, something softer, something almost amused. But you should get some sleep, he murmured. We'll move at dawn. I nodded, but I didn't miss the way his shoulders had relaxed just slightly, the way the tension in his jaw had eased. Maybe I hadn't gotten all his walls down, but I had found a crack, and something told me that was enough. For now. Act 2. I never thought I'd miss the cave, or the storm, or even trudging through the woods with Dominic shooting broody looks at trees. But as we stepped into the Blackridge Pack's village, I realized I absolutely preferred all of that to this, the moment we crossed into the settlement, because calling it a village didn't quite do justice to the blend of rustic cabins, stone buildings, and towering trees woven into the landscape. Every conversation, every movement, every single breath stopped, and then, as one, they all turned to look at me. It was the kind of reception that made a person rethink every life choice that had led them to this moment. Well, this isn't ominous, I muttered under my breath. Dominic, because he was apparently allergic to reassurance, just let out a low grunt and kept walking. I kept my steps even, kept my expression neutral, kept my hands in plain sight, because even though these people weren't currently in their wolf forms, they still felt like a pack, their movements, their breathing, the way they shifted and adjusted around me, in perfect wordless unity. And in that unity I was the only other. A woman stepped out of a doorway, wiping her hands on an apron, her sharp assessing gaze dragging over me before landing on Dominic. "You've got some nerve showing your face here," she said, voice calm but loaded. Dominic barely flicked an eye toward her. "Nice to see you too, Tessa." A ripple of tension moved through the watching crowd. It wasn't outright hostility, more like discomfort, worry, or worse, expectation. Because whatever Dominic's deal with these people was, they weren't just waiting for him to explain himself. They were waiting to see if he belonged here at all. And I had a very, very bad feeling that my presence was not improving his case. Great, just great. I forced a bright, if slightly nervous, smile. "Hi, I'm Serena. Total human. Not a threat, just here for some, soil." Silence. A kid poked his head around the doorway, looking wide-eyed at me like I'd just announced I was made of chocolate and granting wishes. Tessa sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. "Take her to Gideon," which, from the looks everyone exchanged, was less helpful suggestion and more enjoy your execution. Dominic exhaled, as if he'd been expecting this, then jerked his head toward a larger cavern near the center of the village. "Come on," he muttered. And because I had no other choice, unless I wanted to see just how fast I could outrun an entire pack of werewolves, I followed. The inside of the Alpha's cabin was warm. Wood-paned walls, a stone fireplace crackling with flames, the scent of burning cedar thick in the air. It was the kind of place that could be cozy. It wasn't. Because he was there, Alpha Gideon. I wasn't sure what I expected. Maybe some imposing, mountain-sized guy with a deep voice and a habit of casually sharpening knives. Instead, Gideon was lean, silver-threaded through his dark hair, his sharp grey eyes colder than the wind outside. He sat behind a solid wooden desk, fingers steepled, his gaze flicking between me and Dominic like he was already doing the calculations, already weighing the risks. He let the silence stretch just long enough for it to be uncomfortable. Then, finally, "So," his voice was low, rough, "you brought a human into my territory." I resisted the urge to shift on my feet, to make myself smaller under that piercing stare. I hadn't done anything wrong, technically, but that didn't mean I was off the hook. Dominic, to his credit, didn't flinch. "She was being hunted, and that concerns us. Why?" Dominic's jaw flexed. "They weren't just hunting her." That seemed to interest Gideon, but not enough to let the tension drop. His gaze flicked to me again, and I had the very distinct feeling that this man saw everything. "What were you doing in my land?" I took a breath, called on every ounce of composure I had, and said smoothly, "Geological research. I study land shifts and mineral compositions. My employer is funding an environmental study. Technically not a lie, technically not the truth either." Gideon tilted his head, studying me. "And your employer is?" I smiled. "A private firm?" His silence stretched. Dominic shifted beside me, just slightly, probably because he could hear how fast my heart was racing. I kept my hands at my sides, kept my expression easy, kept my posture calm, even as my stomach knotted. I didn't know Gideon, but I knew men like him. He wasn't just looking for what I said, he was looking for what I didn't say. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Gideon leaned back in his chair. "You're lying." I swallowed. "I'm not." A sharp look. "You're lying," he repeated, "but not about everything." He exhaled, gaze dragging back to Dominic. "And yet you're vouching for her." Dominic said nothing, but Gideon didn't need him to. He watched him for a long moment, some silent, weighty conversation passing between them. Then, slowly, Gideon stood. "If you stay under my rules," he said, his voice even. "You don't go near the sacred lands, you don't cross my enforcers, you don't cause problems." I exhaled carefully. "I can do that." His expression didn't shift. "And if I find out you're here for anything else, if I even suspect you're a threat to this pack—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I gave him my best, most reassuring smile. "Understood." Dominic's tension didn't ease as Gideon finally nodded, stepping back. I had the distinct feeling that I had passed a test, a very temporary one, because if Gideon was good at anything, it was waiting for people to slip, and I had just put myself right under his watchful eye. The moment we stepped out of Gideon's cabin, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Well," I muttered, "that was fun. Let's do it again sometime." Dominic made a sound that was either a scoff or a growl. Hard to tell with him. The village was still watching us, not as obviously as before. Some of them had gone back to their work, chopping wood, carrying supplies, tending to fires, but I could feel them, the weight of 100 suspicious eyes tracking me as I moved. I wasn't welcome here. That much was clear. "Okay," I said, falling into step beside Dominic as we walked through the dirt paths between the cabins. So I'm getting the feeling that your people aren't exactly rolling out the red carpet for me." He kept his gaze forward. "They don't trust outsiders?" "Yeah, I got that from the whole death glare parade." I crossed my arms. "Is this a werewolf thing or just a you thing?" His jaw ticked. "It's a safety thing." I stole a glance at him, at the sharp cut of his profile, at the way his shoulders stayed tense even now. "This is about you, isn't it?" I said, slowing slightly. "They don't just hate me. They hate that you brought me here." He stopped walking. Just stopped. I nearly ran into him. Because again, the man was built like a damn stone wall and didn't seem to grasp the concept of personal space. For a second, he didn't speak. Then, low and quiet, "I don't belong here either." The words hit something deep in my chest, something I didn't quite know what to do with. I tilted my head, studying him. "Then why did you bring me?" His golden eyes flicked to me, unreadable. "Because you needed help." I opened my mouth, closed it. Because really, what was I supposed to say to that? The guy had basically risked whatever scraps of reputation he had left with this pack to drag me into their territory, knowing full well it would make things worse for him. And now, standing here, his body angled slightly toward mine, his stance too stiff, too tense, as if he was ready to lunge at the first person who so much as breathed wrong in my direction. Oh, he was protecting me, even now. Even against his own people. Warmth curled low in my stomach, unexpected and uninvited. That was dangerous. I took a breath, forcing myself to keep it light. I must be some really impressive geologist to be worth all this trouble. Something flickered in his expression, something fast and fleeting. "I wouldn't know," he said. "I don't care about rocks." I grinned. "That's just because you haven't met the right rocks yet." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "You talk too much." "And yet you keep listening." He turned away, but not before I caught it. The tiniest upward twitch of his lips, gone before I could call him on it. Interesting. Very interesting. I jogged to catch up with him as he started walking again. The pack might have hated me. Gideon might have been watching my every move. But for some reason, Dominic, the growly, broody, exile werewolf who definitely didn't want to be attached to anyone, was keeping me close, and I had a very strong suspicion that neither of us knew what to do about it. "Let me get this straight," I said, crossing my arms as I stood in front of Dominic, ignoring the way his golden eyes darkened. "You drag me here, you insist on playing my personal wolfy bodyguard, and now suddenly I'm the problem?" He exhaled slowly through his nose, which I had already learned was his equivalent of counting to 10 so he didn't throw something, possibly me, into a tree. "The pack doesn't trust you," he said, voice tight. "They barely tolerate me. You think bringing you here made things easier?" I threw my hands up. "Excuse me for not being overjoyed about being the village scapegoat. You think I wanted to be dropped into the middle of some werewolf family feud?" "You should have left." "Oh, sure. I'll just walk out into the woods alone and let the next round of homicidal shifters take a crack at me. Sounds way more fun than sticking around here, being interrogated and side-eyed like I personally invented silver bullets." His jaw clenched, the muscle ticking dangerously. I should have stopped there. I really should have. I was cold, exhausted, and done with being treated like the world's most inconvenient houseguest. "You know what, Dominic? Maybe this wouldn't be such a mess if you actually trusted someone for once." Something in the air snapped. In a blink, he closed the distance between us, his broad frame towering over me, his heat licking at my skin. "Trust?" His voice was low, rough, almost dangerous. "You want me to trust you? When you won't even tell me why you're really here?" I sucked in a breath, my pulse pounding. "You're lying," he said, and it wasn't a question. "You've been lying since the moment I found you." The worst part, he wasn't wrong. I had lied. About my research, about who had really sent me, about how much I knew or suspected, about what was hidden in these mountains. But so had he. So have you, I shot back, my voice quieter now but no less sharp. You talk like you don't care what happens to this pack, but I see you. You do care, and that terrifies you, doesn't it? A muscle twitched in his jaw, but he didn't pull away. Neither did I. The air between us went thick, heavy, electric. For a second, neither of us moved. Then I wasn't sure who snapped first. Maybe it was me, sick of the tension, sick of the fire curling low in my belly every time he looked at me like this. Or maybe it was him, sick of fighting whatever this was, sick of holding back. Either way, 1 second we were glaring at each other, breathless and furious. The next, his mouth was on mine. Heat exploded. His hands gripped my waist, rough, desperate, like he had to anchor himself or risk losing control completely. My fingers tangled in his shirt, clutching hard as if I was any better off. It wasn't soft, it wasn't slow, it was wild, reckless, too much and not enough all at once. He kissed like he fought. Like he didn't believe in half measures. Like the second he touched me, something inside him snapped, and there was no turning back. And God help me, I kissed him right back. His teeth scraped my bottom lip, and I gasped against him, heat curling deep, something dark and dangerous sparking in his eyes. For one dizzy, impossible moment, I felt it, something pulling, something clicking into place, like a thread tightening between us. And then, just as suddenly, he ripped away. We stood there, both of us breathing hard, the fire crackling between us. Dominic swore under his breath, running a hand through his hair, his jaw tight, his entire body coiled like a live wire. "This," he said, voice rough, almost hoarse. "This can't happen." My lips were still tingling, my skin still buzzing, but I managed to tilt my head, arching a brow. "You sure about that? Because I'd say it already did." His eyes locked onto mine, molten gold, burning, and in them I saw it. He knew. Knew that whatever just happened wasn't a mistake. Knew that it wasn't over. Not even close. Dominic stepped back like he'd been burned. 1 second his hands had been on me, his mouth devastating, his body pressed so close I could feel every sharp breath, and the next he was gone. He turned away, muscles tight, hands curled into fists like he was fighting something inside himself, something dangerous. "Dominic, no." His voice was low, rough, final. He shook his head, like he was trying to clear it, like he could erase what had just happened between us. "This can't happen." I blinked at him, still breathless, still buzzing, still not entirely convinced I wasn't dreaming. "I think it already did." His jaw clenched. "It was a mistake." A mistake. My lips still tingled, my heart still pounded, my whole body was still humming from the way he had just kissed me like he was starving. "And it was a mistake?" I crossed my arms, lifting a brow. "Wow. A mistake, huh? So, what was the plan? Just accidentally slam your mouth against mine?" His eyes flicked to mine, something raw and wild flashing behind them before he wrenched himself away, like even looking at me was dangerous. "This can't happen," he repeated, his voice tight. He took another step back, then another, and I felt it. The space growing between us. Not just physical distance. Something deeper, something wrong. I frowned, suddenly uneasy. "Dominic!" He shook his head once, as if that could break the pull between us, as if he hadn't just felt what I had, as if we could just pretend the world hadn't just shifted beneath our feet. Then, without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. The forest swallowed him whole, shadows and silence pulling him under. I stood there, the fire still crackling beside me, my skin still warm from his touch, my mind still reeling. What the hell had just happened? And why did it feel like he had just run from something even bigger than me, something he couldn't escape? I had two great talents in life: asking questions I probably shouldn't, and ignoring very obvious warnings. Which was why, instead of doing the sensible thing, like maybe packing up my things and sprinting away from this very territorial pack of werewolves, I was crouched in the middle of Blackridge territory, staring at my scanner like it had personally offended me. Because what it was showing made zero sense. I adjusted the sensitivity, waiting for the readings to roll in again, but the results stayed the same. Beneath the rocky surface of the land, something was pulsing. Not a standard seismic vibration, not residual heat signatures. Energy. And not just any energy. Living energy. I frowned, pressing a palm to the ground, feeling the cool, solid earth beneath my fingers. Logically, I knew I shouldn't be able to feel anything, but logic was quickly taking a back seat to reality. Because the moment my hand touched the dirt, a strange, buzzing warmth spread up my arm. I jerked back, heart hammering. Nope, that wasn't normal. I glanced at the scanner again. The pulses were rhythmic. And even weirder, they were shifting. Like they knew I was here. I swallowed hard, resisting the urge to glance over my shoulder. It was ridiculous. The ground wasn't alive. It wasn't watching me. Right? But the feeling didn't go away, and the more I stared at the readings, the more I knew. This was why Luther Voss was so interested in Blackridge. Not just because it was werewolf territory, not just because of the resources, because something was buried here, something powerful. And I had a sinking feeling that whatever it was waking up. I should have known better than to be alone in the woods, especially these woods. Especially after poking at the ground like I was ringing a supernatural doorbell. But in my defense, it wasn't technically my fault. My scanner had gone haywire, flashing erratic readings, and instead of doing the smart thing, like, I don't know, leaving, I'd followed the signal deeper into the trees, which was how I found myself currently running for my life. A snarl cut through the air behind me, low and guttural, far too close. I didn't waste time looking back. I knew what I'd see. A wolf, not Dominic, not any of the Blackridge pack. This one was bigger, leaner, its fur streaked with scars, its eyes burning with something wrong. A rogue. I vaulted over a fallen tree, my boots barely landing before I was moving again, heart hammering. I'd like to say I had some brilliant plan, some escape route mapped out. I didn't. I was human. And no matter how fast I ran, a werewolf was always going to be faster. The forest blurred around me, my lungs burned, and then the ground vanished. I tumbled forward, my ankle catching on an exposed root, sending me crashing onto my back. Pain shot through me, stars bursting behind my eyelids, but before I could scramble up, a weight slammed into my chest, knocking the air from my lungs. I gasped, staring up into a set of glowing yellow eyes. The rogue hovered over me, its breath hot, smelling of earth and blood. Its lips curled back, fangs glinting in the fractured moonlight. My body locked up, my pulse roaring in my ears. Then, just when I thought I was about to be turned into lone woman in the woods soup, the wolf did something strange. It didn't bite. Instead, it spoke. "You don't belong here." Its voice was gravelly, distorted, half human, half something else. The words sent a cold ripple through my bones. I swallowed hard, my hands digging into the dirt beneath me. Yeah, well, not exactly news, buddy. The wolf's ears twitched. Leave, now. And then, just as fast as it had appeared, it was gone. 1 second, its weight was pressing me down, its breath hot against my skin. The next, it had vanished into the trees, its shadow swallowed by the dark. I lay there for a moment, chest heaving, my brain struggling to catch up. That had just happened. That had definitely just happened. The rogue hadn't attacked me, it had warned me, and I had no idea why. I made it back to my campsite just before dawn, my limbs aching, my ankles screaming in protest with every step. I was scraped up, exhausted, and really not in the mood for any more surprises, so, of course, there was one waiting for me. My tablet sat on my small camp table exactly where I'd left it. But the screen? It was on, and there was a message. Not from my research team, not from my so-called funders. From him, Luthor Voss. My stomach turned as I tapped the screen, my pulse hammering as the message expanded. Miss Callaway, I'm pleased with your progress. Keep going, we're watching. I swallowed hard, my breath suddenly too loud in the quiet morning air. Not listening, not tracking, watching. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head, scanning the tree line. No movement, no sounds. But the feeling was there. The rogue had told me I didn't belong. And now Voss was making sure I stayed. This wasn't just research anymore. This was a game, and I was caught right in the middle of it. It turns out, getting cryptic warnings from a possibly murderous rogue werewolf wasn't even in the top 5 worst things to happen to me this week. Because this was worse. I sat cross-legged in my tent, my tablet balanced on my knee, scrolling through files I was never supposed to see. Files that made my stomach knot, my hands shake, and my whole body go cold. Luthor Voss wasn't funding an environmental study. He wasn't even interested in the land itself. He was after what was beneath it. Blackridge wasn't just rich in resources. It was alive with something else, something pulsing in the rock, something ancient, something powerful. And Voss, in his infinite let's play God wisdom, wanted it. Worse, he wanted them, the shifters. Because according to these files, the power running through Blackridge wasn't just some unexplained geological phenomenon. To their blood, their DNA, and Luthor had plans for it. Extraction, testing, replication. My stomach turned. This wasn't just a land grab, it was a hunt. And I'd led him straight to them. Dominic wasn't easy to find when he didn't want to be, but I was pissed off, sleep-deprived, and filled with a kind of reckless determination that had gotten me into most of my life's disasters. So I found him anyway. He was near the training grounds, shirtless and swinging an axe like it had personally wronged him. His muscles flexed with every movement, sweat glistening over his skin, his jaw tight, which was really inconvenient because I needed to be mad at him, and it was hard to stay mad when his whole wilderness lumberjack aesthetic was aggressively distracting. He barely spared me a glance. "You shouldn't be here." "Yeah, well, you shouldn't be on the verge of getting sold off to the highest bidder, but here we are." That got his attention. The axe stopped mid-swing, his body going still. "What?" I took a breath. "I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." His golden eyes locked onto mine, sharp and assessing. "Then maybe don't say it." "Yeah, see, that's not how this works." I stepped closer, gripping my tablet so tightly my fingers ached. "I found out what Luthor Voss is after. It's not the land. It's you, all of you." His expression didn't change, but I felt the shift, the sudden crackling tension in the air. I pushed forward. "Blackridge isn't just sacred ground. It's charged with something, energy, power, and it's tied to the pack's DNA. Voss wants to extract it, Dominic. He's planning to—" I didn't get to finish. A howl cut through the village, long and urgent, followed by the pounding of boots against dirt. One of the enforcers appeared, breathless. "Attack incoming! They're already at the southern border!" Dominic's head snapped toward him, his entire body tensed, his stance shifting from "what the hell are you talking about" to ready to rip someone's throat out, and then his gaze swung back to me. It hit like a slap. Like the moment he knew. Knew what I had been hiding. Knew I hadn't just stumbled onto this research. Knew, even before I could say it, that I had worked for Voss. "I can explain." I didn't even get the words fully out before Dominic moved. 1 second he was standing in front of me, fury rolling off him like a storm. The next he had me, gripping my wrist, dragging me through the village at a speed I couldn't fight. "Dominic, stop!" He didn't. The pack was gathering, sensing the shift in the air, the danger looming. I saw Tessa step forward, eyes narrowed. Gideon emerged from his cabin, his gaze sharp and knowing. Dominic shoved me forward into the open, where everyone could see. I felt the weight of their stares, felt the moment they realized. She knew. Dominic's voice was rough, laced with something barely restrained. She knew about Voss, about his plans, and she didn't tell us. Gasps rippled through the pack. My stomach dropped. I didn't. I sucked in a breath, forcing myself to stand tall, to meet Gideon's cool, assessing stare. I didn't know what he was planning, not at first. And when I did, Dominic cut me off. You still didn't tell me. It landed like a blow, because it was true, because he was right. I had hesitated. I had waited. And now it was too late. Gideon's expression hardened. His voice was quiet, but sharp as a blade. She can't stay. The decision came like a death sentence. I sucked in a breath. Gideon. Dominic didn't look at me, didn't argue, didn't hesitate. She's already leaving. And just like that, I was exiled. Again. But this time, it hurt so much worse. The night smelled like smoke and destruction. I saw it before I heard it, the thick curling plumes of black swallowing the sky, the glow of fire spreading like a sickness through the trees. I saw it. The sacred lands were burning. And Luthor's men? They were already here. Gunfire cracked through the night. Shouts echoed between the trees. I watched, heart pounding, as shifters fought, shifting mid-air, their massive wolf forms launching into battle, claw and fang against bullets and steel. It was chaos. Pure. Brutal. Devastating. And I wasn't in it. I was outside the pack now, banished, watching from the ridgeline, helpless as the place I'd just started to think of as home was ripped apart, and it was my fault, because I had led them here. Luther had used me, and I'd let him. I clenched my fists, stepping forward before reason could stop me. But then, through the thick smoke, I saw him. Dominic. He moved like a nightmare, a force of nature, all instinct and violence, cutting through the battlefield like a blade. He shifted mid-strike, his human form snapping into something other, something deadly. His black wolf barreled through Luthor's men, teeth flashing, claws tearing through armor like paper. They shot at him. He didn't stop, didn't hesitate, and if I hadn't been watching, I might have thought him unstoppable. But then, a blast, too close, the ground shook and Dominic staggered back, shifting just in time for the bullet to miss his heart, but not by much. I felt it before I saw it, the ripple of pain through the bond, the sharp, gutting tear of it. Dominic collapsed to one knee, blood seeping through his side, and just like that, my world snapped into focus. The pack was fighting, bleeding, dying. Dominic was down, and I was standing on the sidelines, useless, because I had made a mistake I was about to fix. I spun on my heel, heart hammering, lungs burning. Luther had done this, and I was going to stop him. I was done watching from the outside. I was done running. If I had to walk straight into the lion's den, into the belly of the beast, so be it. Because if there was one thing I knew with absolute certainty, it was this. Luthor Voss had underestimated me, and he was about to regret it. Breaking into a top-secret, highly guarded, probably filled with mercenaries who would shoot me on sight facility was not in my usual skill set, but desperation was a great teacher. And guilt? Guilt was an even better motivator. The facility loomed ahead. Cold steel against the dark forest, a jagged scar cutting through the land. Luthor Voss never built anything that blended in. His structures weren't meant to exist with the world. They were meant to own it. Well, not tonight. I crept toward the perimeter, keeping low, the stolen security badge pressed tight in my palm. I had swiped it from one of Voss's men, who very stupidly left it clipped to his belt while taking a cigarette break. Honestly, rookie mistake. The scanner at the entrance beeped. I held my breath as the red light flickered, and then mercifully turned green. I slipped inside. The air was colder than I expected, humming with electricity and something wrong. The walls gleamed, too clean, too sterile, the fluorescent lighting casting sharp, unnatural shadows. I moved quickly, pressing against the wall as I approached the first door. Beyond the reinforced glass, I saw them. Wolves. Not just wolves. Shifters. strapped to tables, hooked up to machines, their fur matted with blood and sweat, their chests rising and falling in shallow, laboured breaths. My stomach twisted. Luthor wasn't just experimenting on them, he was harvesting them. I swallowed against the bile rising in my throat. I had known, at least I'd suspected, but seeing it, feeling the weight of their suffering press against my skin, that was different. That was unforgivable. And it was going to stop. I reached for the control panel beside the door, fingers flying over the screen. The locks were coded, but nothing I couldn't handle. Voss thought he was untouchable, but he still used human technology, and humans made mistakes. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. One of the wolves, silver fur, lean, bright amber eyes, lifted his head weakly. He bared his teeth, a soft growl rumbling from his chest. I held up my hands. Easy, I'm here to help. He blinked. His breathing was ragged. His eyes flickered over me, uncertain, then sharp, like he knew me. A strange, familiar hume crawled under my skin, something just below the surface, something I couldn't name. I shoved it down. No time for weird hey-do-I-know-you moments. I moved quickly, unfastening restraints, detaching wires, keeping my voice low and soothing. We need to move fast. Can you walk? The wolf, no, man, groaned, shifting slightly, his limbs shaky but solid. I'll take that as a yes, I muttered. One down, too many left to go. I was going to burn this place to the ground, but first I had to find the others, and because the universe clearly wasn't done screwing with me, that's when I found the inscription. It was carved into the stone, hidden beneath layers of steel plating, just barely visible through the cracks of a crumbling wall. Ancient, golden, glowing. I stopped, because my chest ached, not the bad kind of ache, not fear, not pain, something old, something deep, something that recognized this place. My fingers brushed over the symbols, tracing the rough edges. I didn't understand the words, but the moment I touched them, something inside me clicked. A voice, not my own, whispered in my mind. Blood of the first, daughter of the moon, the land calls you home. My breath hitched. No, that wasn't possible. Except it was. I had always felt connected to this place, hadn't I? Like the land knew me. Like the wolves recognized me. Because I wasn't just some scientist who got tangled in their world. I belonged to it. I wasn't just drawn to Blackridge. I was meant to be here, which meant this fight, it was mine. And Luther Voss? He was about to find out exactly how wrong he was to underestimate me. Breaking into a top-secret lab? Surprisingly doable. Breaking out? Not so much. I flattened myself against the cold steel wall, listening to the distant click of boots on tile. Luthor's men were making their rounds, checking security feeds, probably wondering why half their guests were no longer strapped to machines. Oops. I clutched the scrap of paper in my fist, my pulse hammering. It wasn't much, just a torn corner of my notebook, scribbled with Luthor. Mountainside facility. He's taking them north. Not exactly poetry, but I didn't have time for a sonnet. Now I just needed to get it to Dominic, which meant getting past security, avoiding the 6-foot goons with assault rifles, and somehow making sure the note didn't get intercepted. You know, no big deal. I exhaled slowly, pressing a hand to my stomach. Okay, Serena, you got this. You're smart, you're capable, you're... A flashlight beam swept across the hallway. Clap. I ducked behind a supply cart just as a guard strode past. He muttered something into his radio, paused at a door, then moved on. Okay. No time for pep talks. I peeked around the corner, eyeing the ventilation shaft above me. Now, normally I'd be the first to call out how wildly unrealistic it is when movie characters just shimmy through air ducts like it's a casual stroll in the park. But at this moment, with no other options, it was looking like my best bet. I grabbed the grate, yanked. It came loose with a soft pop. One step at a time, Callaway. I climbed up, crawling awkwardly into the tight space, feeling very die-hard but significantly less cool. I wiggled forward, ignoring the dust coating my jeans, and peered through another vent opening below me. Bingo, a courier, a young shifter, maybe 17, probably running low-level errands for the mercenaries, was standing near the back exit, arms crossed, looking bored out of his mind. Perfect. I carefully tore another scrap of paper, scribbled one word, Dominic, and folded it tight. Then, with the kind of finesse that only comes from extreme sleep deprivation and severe adrenaline, I flicked it through the grate. He landed right in front of him. He blinked, looked down, frowned, then, "Praise all things good in the universe." He picked it up. I held my breath as he unfolded it, his lips moving slightly as he read. And then he stuffed it in his pocket and took off running. I slumped back against the metal, releasing a breath. Message sent. Now I just had to stay alive long enough for Dominic to get it, and preferably not get shot in the process. Pain had a taste, metallic, bitter. It sat thick on Dominic's tongue as he pushed up from the dirt, his breath ragged, his body screaming in protest. He'd been down too long. Blood trickled from his side, seeping into the torn fabric of his shirt. Didn't matter, because Serena was out there. She had sent him that note, risked everything to warn him. She had gone in alone, knowing what Voss was capable of. And that? That pissed him off. No, infuriated him. His wolf snarled, restless, pacing beneath his skin, demanding he move, hunt. He was done waiting, done recovering, done holding back. He wiped the blood from his mouth, rolled his shoulders, and let his gaze settle on the pack gathered around him. Every one of them bruised, battered, but standing. They were watching him, waiting for his command. He gave them one. "We take it back," Dominic growled, voice low and lethal. "We take everything back." A ripple of growls answered him. His body coiled, every muscle locked tight as he turned toward the fortress in the distance, its steel walls glowing under the cold, sterile light. That place had taken his people, had her inside. It was time to end this. His pack moved as one, a seamless force cutting through the night, silent shadows against the barren landscape. A guard barely had time to register the threat before Dominic's claws met his throat. He barely felt the resistance as the body hit the ground. Chaos erupted. Bullets cracked through the air, shouts echoing through the compound. But it didn't matter. His wolves were fast, relentless. They tore through Luther's men like they were nothing more than obstacles, inconveniences. The scent of blood and fear filled the air. And Dominic, he tore through them like a force of nature, like vengeance made flesh. His wolf howled, demanding Serena, demanding his mate. He hadn't admitted it, not fully, not to himself, not to her. But now, there was no denying it. She was his. And he would burn this place to the ground before he let Voss keep her. Dominic's claws sank into another guard, his body shifting fluidly between man and beast as he carved a path forward toward the heavy steel doors that stood between him and the woman who had turned his world upside down. His hands curled into fists. The door didn't stand a chance. He ripped it from its hinges. And then he stepped inside. The fortress belonged to them now. Pain was a distant thing, just a whisper at the edges of Serena's awareness. It didn't matter. Not the bruises on her ribs, not the ache in her limbs, not the sting of the gash on her arm, because Luthor's men were everywhere, and she was done playing the helpless damsel. The fight outside had bled into the facility, chaos crackling through the halls like wildfire. Shouts echoed. Boots pounded against the floor, claws scraped metal. Serena shoved a table against the doorway, barricading herself inside the lab. It wouldn't hold for long, but she didn't need long. She just needed to finish this. The computers in front of her hummed, lines of encrypted data flashing across the screen. Voss's research, his twisted plans for extracting shifter DNA, for weaponizing their souls. And now it was gone. She punched in the final override code, fingers flying across the keyboard, heart hammering. The system let out a high-pitched beep. Confirmation. Erase complete. She sagged against the desk for just a second, breath rushing out. Luthor Voss had spent years building this empire, hoarding knowledge like a dragon with stolen gold, and she had just burned it to the ground. The door behind her rattled. A hard shove, then another. Not much time. She spun, grip tightening on the weapon she'd swiped from one of the fallen mercenaries. Just a standard-issue handgun, but it would do the job. The door burst open. She didn't hesitate. 2 shots! Straight to the first guard's chest. He crumpled. The second lunged. She ducked, drove her elbow into his gut, then finished him off with a brutal kick to the ribs. She wasn't trained for this. She wasn't a fighter, but she was angry, and that made her dangerous. A growl rattled the air behind her. She turned, breath catching. A wolf! Not Dominic. This one was massive, his fur a dark grey streaked with silver, his teeth bared, saliva dripping from his fangs, his yellow eyes locked onto hers with nothing but hate. Not a rogue, not a prisoner, a loyalist. One of Voss' pets. He lunged. She didn't think, just reacted. He dropped low, rolling beneath his attack, barely missing the snap of his teeth. He landed hard, claws scraping across the floor. Serena scrambled back, heart thundering. The wolf crouched, ready to spring again. And then the wall exploded. A blur of black fur. A snarl so deep it rattled her bones. "Dominic!" He hit the other wolf hard, their bodies crashing into the far wall. Fangs tore, claws raked, blood sprayed across the metal floor. Serena pressed back against the desk, watching as Dominic moved with ruthless precision. He was bigger, faster, meaner. Every strike calculated, every move designed to kill, and he did. With one final vicious twist, Dominic ripped out the wolf's throat. Silence fell. His chest heaved, golden eyes burning as he straightened, his massive frame still trembling with rage. Serena swallowed hard, pushing off the desk. She should be scared. She should feel some primal part of her recoil at the brutality of it. But all she felt was relief. And then heat, because his gaze landed on her, still wild, still hungry, but different now, not just territorial, not just possessive, something more. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides. Serena barely had time to react before he grabbed her, yanking her against him, his body solid and alive against hers, his scent, dark pine, wild earth, him, wrapped around her, seeping into her bones. He cupped her face, his thumb grazing over her cheek, and his voice came out rough, ragged. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to look anywhere but at him. His grip tightened, his forehead dropping to hers. "I fell to you fighting," he muttered. Her breath hitched. The mate bond. She wasn't sure how much she believed in it, how much she trusted fate to play matchmaker, but right now, she couldn't deny the pull between them. Slowly, carefully, she reached up, pressing her palm to his chest, right over his hammering heart. "I wasn't going to sit back and let them win," she murmured. His jaw ticked, his eyes burned. "You should have run." She huffed a quiet laugh, fingers curling slightly into his shirt. "Yeah, well, you should have learned by now. I never do what I'm supposed to." Dominic exhaled heavily, pressing his forehead harder against hers, as if he could merge them, as if he needed to feel her closer than was physically possible. His hands slid down, gripping her hips, pulling her flush against him. "You terrify me, Serena." She smirked, her fingers trailing up his chest. "Good." A sharp breath. Then his mouth crashed onto hers. It was raw, desperate, nothing like their first kiss. This wasn't a battle of wills, wasn't a fight for dominance. This was surrender. And finally, she let herself give in. The world smelled like fire and blood. The fortress was in ruins, flames licking at the walls, smoke curling through the shattered remains of Luthor's empire. The sounds of battle had faded, replaced by the heavy silence of victory. But Dominic wasn't done yet. Not until he was dead. Luthor Voss stood in the middle of his ruined throne room, blood smeared across his face, his once pristine suit torn and filthy. He still held himself like a man who had control, like a man who believed he could talk his way out of this. Dominic bared his teeth. "You're out of pawns, Vosh." Luthor chuckled, low and dark, wiping blood from his mouth. "You think this ends with me?" He lifted his chin, eyes gleaming with something close to amusement. "I may have underestimated you, Veil, but I assure you there will always be another." Dominic stalked forward, every movement lethal, precise. His wolf prowled just beneath the surface, itching to end this. "You took my people," Dominic growled, voice thick with rage. "You experimented on them, hunted them, used them." Luthor shrugged. "For science." Dominic lunged. Luthor dodged, barely. He stumbled back, breathing hard, but he wasn't afraid. Not yet. That pissed Dominic off more. He let his wolf surge forward, let his muscles stretch, his bones snap, his hands curl into claws. Luthor had spent years studying his kind, trying to break them, trying to turn them into something less. And now? Now he would learn firsthand that he had never controlled them. Luthor pulled a gun from his coat, fast, practiced. Dominic twisted, the bullet grazing his ribs but missing anything vital. The pain barely registered. He lunged again, this time grabbing Luthor by the throat and slamming him against the wall. Luthor gasped, fingers clawing at Dominic's grip, but Dominic didn't loosen it. "You think you're the apex predator here?" Dominic growled, his voice thick with the rumble of his wolf. "You think power is something you steal?" He squeezed tighter, watching as Luthor's face turned red. "Power is earned. It's defended. It's protected." Luthor gasped, eyes widening. Dominic leaned in, voice low, raw. "And you will never touch my people again." With one sharp, brutal motion, Dominic ripped out his throat. Luthor choked, his body jerking. Then he crumpled, lifeless. The weight of it hit the air. Luthor Voss was dead. And just like that. His grip on Blackridge was gone. Dominic exhaled, rolling his shoulders, his body still thrumming with the need to destroy, to tear apart. But the battle was over. It was over. His wolf let out a low, satisfied growl. Then, "Dominic!" His head snapped up. Serena stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. She was scraped, bruised, her hair a mess, her lips still swollen from his kiss, and yet she had never looked more beautiful. The moment stretched, something thick and unspoken passing between them. Then, finally, she took a slow step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's done?" Dominic looked down at Luthor's body, then back at her. He nodded. "It's done." A breath shuddered out of her, relief washing over her features. And Dominic? For the first time in years he felt free, felt whole, and when she closed the remaining space between them, when she reached for him with hesitant, trembling hands, he didn't stop her, didn't want to stop her. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her, holding her. Because he had won, because they had won, and she was his. Now, always, forever. Smoke curled into the dawn sky, thick and acrid, carrying the scent of burnt wood, blood, and something deeper, something final. It was over. But victory always came at a price. The pack moved silently through the battlefield, tending to the wounded, gathering the dead. No cheers, no celebration, just quiet, aching relief. Dominic stood in the center of it all. A presence so solid, so unshakable, that it felt like the earth itself might lean toward him. His shirt was torn, streaked with blood, some his, some not, but he was still standing, still breathing, still alpha, and for the first time in years the pack looked at him, not with wariness, not with the suspicion that had followed him since his exile, with trust, because he had led them through the fire, dragged them out of the ruins, and brought them back to their land, their home. And they knew now, Dominic Veil wasn't just a rogue wolf anymore. He was theirs. Gideon stepped forward, his face grave, but his eyes holding something like respect. He nodded once. "You belong here, Dominic." A simple sentence, but one that meant everything. Dominic exhaled, the tension in his shoulders loosening just slightly. He turned, scanning the crowd, searching for the only person who mattered right now. And then, there she was, standing at the edge of the clearing, arms wrapped around herself, exhaustion lining her face. Serena. She hadn't left. And something inside him settled. They still didn't fully trust me. I could see it in the way they watched, the way some of them kept their distance, quiet and assessing. And I got it. I'd led Luther here, even if it hadn't been intentional. I put their home in danger. I'd been human in a world that didn't have a place for me. But I wasn't leaving. Not now. Not after everything. Tessa was the first to step forward. She looked me over, eyes sharp, then huffed a quiet breath. "Well, you didn't die." I lifted a brow. "Not for lack of trying." A beat of silence, then a smirk, small but there. "You fought for us," she said, her voice softer now. "That matters." One by one, others started to nod, the weight of their wariness lifting just slightly. They weren't ready to call me one of them, but they weren't going to push me out either. I could live with that. Then, suddenly, a shadow loomed over me. Heat pressed against my back, and just like that, Dominic was there. I didn't turn, but I felt him. The solid presence, the quiet dominance that wrapped around me like a second skin. His fingers brushed my wrist, just barely, and my pulse jumped. "They'll come around," he murmured, low and rough. I swallowed, tilting my head up to meet his gaze. He wasn't looking at the pack. He was looking at me, as if I was the only thing that mattered, as if I was his. A slow, twisting heat curled in my stomach. Maybe I was. Dominic's fingers slid up, catching my chin, forcing me to keep looking at him. His golden eyes burned, something possessive and unshakable settling in them. "You're staying?" It wasn't a question. I breathed out a quiet laugh. Wasn't planning on going anywhere. His lips curved just slightly, and then he kissed me. Not hard, not desperate, slow, deep, like a promise, like an answer, like a bond snapping into place. And this time, I didn't fight it. The moon hung heavy and full above the valley, casting its silver glow over the land. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, charred wood, and something else, something new. The end of a war? The start of something else? The pack had begun to retreat to their homes, leaving only the quiet hum of the night, the whisper of the wind through the trees. But I wasn't looking at the moon. I wasn't listening to the wind. I was looking at him. Dominic stood a few feet away, shirtless, his skin streaked with dirt and blood, his muscles taut with something I couldn't quite name. He'd been restless all day, pacing, brooding, tension locked in his body as if he were fighting something. I knew what. I just didn't know if he was ready to stop fighting it. I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering slightly as the cool night air kissed my skin. He noticed. Of course he did, because Dominic saw everything. His gaze flicked to me, golden and unreadable, before he exhaled heavily, running a hand through his damp hair. "Come here." I hesitated, just for a second. Then, carefully, I crossed the distance between us. The moment I was close enough, his hands were on me, fingers gripping my waist, pulling me against his heat. I sucked in a breath, pressing my palms against his bare chest, feeling the thump, thump, thump of his heart under my touch. It was fast, too fast. He was nervous. Dominic Veil was nervous. My lips parted, something sharp and sweet curling in my stomach. "What is it?" His fingers tightened, his jaw flexed. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then, finally, "I can't fight it any more." My chest went tight. He inhaled deeply, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm against my lips. I tried to push you away. I tried to pretend this wasn't real. But you're in me, Serena. You've been in me from the moment I saw you." Heat spread through my veins, my fingers curling against his skin. His mouth hovered over mine, his body pressing just enough against me to make me feel light-headed, desperate. "I told myself I couldn't have you," he murmured, his lips brushing mine with every word. "I shouldn't want this." "That fate doesn't decide for me." I swallowed hard, my nails dragging slightly down his chest. "And now?" His hand slid up my back, his grip firm, claiming, his body hard against mine. "Now I'm done pretending." And then, with a growl so deep it rattled my bones, he took my mouth. It wasn't slow, it wasn't gentle, it was hot, demanding, devastating. A kiss that owned, a kiss that sealed, a kiss that said, "Mine." I gasped against him, my body arching, heat licking at my skin as he wrapped his arms fully around me, hauling me closer. His fingers tangled in my hair, his tongue sweeping against mine in slow, consuming strokes. The bond snapped, like a lock clicking into place, like a tether wrapping around us. Tight. I felt it. He felt it, and we both knew there was no going back now, no doubt, no fear, just us. His forehead pressed to mine, his breath heavy, his hands still locked on my body. "You're mine," he rasped, voice thick with something raw, something final. I ran my fingers down his jaw, my own breath unsteady. Always. And under the full moon, beneath the night sky, Dominic Veil claimed me as his mate, and I claimed him right back. The moon was full, glowing bright over Blackridge, casting silver light across the valley. It wasn't just another night. It was our night. Laughter carried through the air, warm and rich, weaving through the sound of crackling bonfires and the steady drum of music. The pack was celebrating, drinking, dancing, living. After everything we had lost, everything we had fought for, we had won. And damned if we weren't going to enjoy it. I stood at the edge of the gathering, my fingers wrapped around a warm mug, watching as shifters moved like shadows through the firelight. Some in human form, some fully shifted, their wolves lounging lazily, eyes glowing content. This was home now, my home. That realization still sent a little shiver through me. Months ago I'd been a geologist chasing anomalies, a scientist pretending she wasn't drawn to something more. Now I had a pack, a mate, and a life in the middle of a supernatural world I once thought was nothing more than myth. I wasn't just staying in Blackridge, I was a part of it. My work was different now. Still research, still studying the land, but no longer for some faceless employer with a hidden agenda. Now I used my knowledge to protect it, to make sure no one like Luthor Voss could ever touch this place again. I felt him before I saw him. Heat, solid and steady, pressed against my back, a strong arm curling around my waist, pulling me flush against a familiar, impossibly hard chest. Dominic. His lips brushed my temple, slow and lingering, his scent, earth, pine, home, wrapping around me. I leaned into him instinctively, my free hand resting against the arm he had locked around my middle. "You're late to the party." His breath rumbled against my skin. "I was watching you." I turned my head slightly, tilting up to meet his gaze. "You do that a lot." His golden eyes gleamed, his mouth curving in that infuriatingly sexy, knowing way. "You like it." I did, not that I'd admit it. I turned in his arms, sliding my hands up his chest, over the soft fabric of his shirt. The pack's new alpha, my alpha, looked every bit the part. Strong, capable, mine. Dominic didn't just lead his people now, they followed him. Not out of fear, not out of obligation, out of loyalty, out of love. He had earned this, and I couldn't have been prouder of him. "You should enjoy your own celebration," I murmured, fingers tracing slow circles against his chest. "You are the reason we're all still standing." His lips twitched. "And you think I'd rather be anywhere else but here, with you?" The slow, teasing heat in his voice sent warmth curling low in my stomach. I huffed. I think you enjoy making a scene, Dominic smirked, sliding his hands down my back, over my hips, gripping me in a way that promised he had absolutely no intention of keeping things tame. You want a scene, mate? His voice dropped, lower, thicker. I'll give you one. Before I could roll my eyes, because, honestly, this man lived to push my buttons. He kissed me. Slow, deep, thorough, like we had all the time in the world. The world around us faded, the pack, the bonfires, the music. There was only him. The bond between us pulsed, strong and unbreakable, wrapping us together like the land itself had tied us in its roots. When we finally pulled apart, Dominic's thumb grazed my bottom lip, his eyes burning into mine. "You happy?" he murmured. It wasn't a question. I exhaled softly, threading my fingers through his hair, tugging him down just enough so I could press my lips to his. "Yeah," I whispered against his mouth. "I am." His arms tightened around me, his heartbeat steady, strong. Mine. And as the moon rose higher over Blackridge, over our land, I knew. We had won more than a war. We had won us. And there was nothing that could take that away. Not now, not ever.